Hey, folks, welcome to another edition of Broken Brains with Bruce Parkman, sponsored by the Mac Parkman Foundation, where we look at the issue of repetitive brain trauma in the form of repetitive head impacts and how it impacts the brains and mental well-being of athletes and our children, and repetitive blast exposure and how it impacts the brains and mental well-being of our veteran population. And why we talk about this, we bring on authors and doctors and researchers and players and parents, because this issue is not taught in our medical, psychological, nursing populations. So it's up to you to be informed, to make those decisions about those that you care and love, and those that you know that are suffering right now because they might have been exposed through contact sports and military service. Today, another amazing guest on our show, and kind of we're taking a left turn on this one for most of the guests we've had on this, is Dr. Helen Epstein, is a visiting professor of human rights and global public health at Bard College. She writes frequently for the New York Review of Books and other publications, and is the author of 3 books, including Why Live? How Suicide Becomes an Epidemic. She has also worked as a consultant for UNICEF, the World Bank, the Human Rights Watch, and other international organizations. And if you followed Miss Epstein, she has been in the thick of some of the most the crazy places in this world, reporting live. And I am absolutely amazed, and I'm so proud to have her on the show. Miss Epstein, welcome to the show, ma'am.
Thank you so much for having me, Bruce.
It's our pleasure, ma'am. So, before we talk about the book, tell us about yourself. And I mean, I've seen your report for, all over Africa and all over the world, really. So what drove you into this occupation?
Um, I guess I don't know. I used to be a biochemist actually, and I went to Uganda about 30 years ago in East Africa to work on an early version of an AIDS vaccine, and the results were not promising, but I got very interested in public health and how to stop the spread of diseases without, sometimes all the tools we have is our voices. And so I ended up spending a lot of time working on that, working on various public health crises in Africa, including HIV/AIDS, malaria, Ebola, and so on. And then in 2017, a close friend of mine um, took her own life, and it really struck me. I knew she was depressed, but I really didn't know. This wasn't something I expected, and I was very thrown by it. And we can never, very often. Um, a psychologist told me that essentially, um, one always looks back and wonders what one might have said, whether something could have made a difference. Um, but it is actually very hard to predict who will take their lives at any given time. There, out of a thousand people with severe depression, only one person will die by suicide in any given year. So it's really hard to know whether we're missing some crucial signal or something until it's too late. And so I began to wonder, because I'm a kind of a public health person, I began to look into the public health aspects of this and came upon a number of um, cases in which the suicide rate of particular populations began to rise very rapidly, sometimes as much as tenfold in just a few years, which was really suggested a social cause. It suggested something in the social environment was causing this. It was unlikely to be organic, something like brain injury or mental illness, because of the speed at which it occurred. And I began to wonder what those conditions were, because what it meant was that people with suicidal feelings aren't necessarily a species apart. Um, that if this could happen in a population, it could really happen to any one of us. We're all vulnerable to these feelings. So I wanted to know more about what those feelings were and what are the contextual factors that bring them about. And that was why I wrote the book.
And that's, and you start talking about a public health crisis, right? I
Mm,
mean, the level of
huge.
suicidal ideation today is unprecedented. Besides issues like we talk about repetitive blast exposure, we have a physiological link to mental illness that we'll dive into a little bit easy later, with obvious links to suicidal ideation. We have a crisis in our younger population and even older populations, really, where suicide has become an acceptable option. And I remember growing up in the '70s, and we had a man, we had one of our neighbors, hung himself, and the whole population is like, the whole neighborhood's like, what? Nobody did this back then, right? And now we don't know of anybody who doesn't know somebody who's taken their life or a family that's been affected by this. So where do you see this? And I just want to let our audience know we're going to be talking about very, very traumatic issues called, suicide, right? So, please take your time with this podcast. If it's going to be affecting you, you don't have to listen to it. But I want to dive into this because I lost my son. And I have had, there's been many days I didn't want to think about suicide, but I don't want to be here no more with my boy, without my guy. And so this is our options to dig into this and let what we're seeing out there. And so back to you, Dr. Epstein. Why is this so? Why is this considered? It's like it's almost acceptable to consider this. Whether it's people boasting about it, trying to get attention, and in today's digital social media, hey, they might cry for help, but a lot of people are carrying this all the way through.
Mm. I think one thing to bear in mind, my condolences to you about your son and to anyone else who's listening who's lost someone close to them. Um, there really ultimately for each suicide there are no answers, but I think one thing that is common to people experiencing suicidal feelings for whatever reason, whether it's brain injury or some other reason or mental illness or some other reason, is that there's a feeling they have no idea how much pain they're going to leave behind. They are in so much pain themselves that they think, I know it sounds crazy, and it is crazy, that they're doing people a favor. And I kind of know this partly because research suggests it. There's a very well known suicide expert psychologist called Thomas Joyner who's actually studied thousands of cases. And this is really a kind of common denominator in many of them. And I experienced it myself once. Antidepressant pills can help lots and lots of people, and they have really helped a lot of people, but they can have
It's
terrible side effects.
they have all of them have black box warnings for this
They
stuff. Yet we
do.
give them out
They
like
do.
candy. Great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I had that side effect, and I've had, bouts of depression in life as many, many people have, but I did not, I suddenly realized, "Oh, my goodness, all the problems in the world would be saved if I weren't here." And it was, weird. I knew something was wrong. I knew something. This wasn't the way, this wasn't normal, and I think, and it was a kind of it's a delusion, and, I don't know. I mean, but the problem is that it's a delusion that is, as you say, increasingly, um, common and has been since, really beginning in the 1970s. There's been a fivefold increase in the United States in suicide among, I guess, working class people, people who, um, um, particularly don't have bachelor's degrees and work in ordinary jobs, whatever. I mean, as we know, the sort of type of work that people do has changed radically since then. Wages have not risen and so on. And um, a lot of the Rust Belt, for example, which is a very high suicide area of the United States, has been very severely affected economically, but also emotionally and psychologically. And
Hmm.
so that helps, I think. I think this is widely recognized by everyone that this has contributed dramatically to a mental health crisis in the country, which at first affected working age people in their 40s, for example, and 50s. This is where the suicide crisis began, but it's now spreading into all groups, including people with BAs, young people particularly, um, and so on. And so it really is becoming, unfortunately, more and more an American norm, and that's absolutely terrifying.
It is. And, you know, and despite, we spend billions of dollars on suicide prevention. Okay. And I know in the military alone, we're still losing the same amount of veterans that but despite the investment of billions of dollars into the military into suicide prevention. Now, we also know that we have overlooked repetitive blast exposure and its impact on the brain until just now. And so we really know, and we do know that the impact of that in contact sports on brains and the damage that results, the mental illness and suicidal ideation are extremely connected as people progress down the spiral. But we have invested billions in
Mhm.
addressing this. Why? And of course, we've invested billions in other public health crises. Ebola. The Mika virus, whatever that thing was called, and but the whole pandemic COVID thing. Okay, yet they're still around. Okay, so why do you think we're not doing this despite this crisis? Despite you can't deny the data, so why are we not, what can we do better?
Well, I think great question. I mean, I think one thing is that counseling services, individual counseling services, psychological counseling really can help, but people really need to stick with it. And that tends to be a real problem. It doesn't work automatically. It doesn't work after one or two sessions. It really is a kind of long engagement in a process, and that's very expensive. And even with the billions of dollars that are spent, um, um, that the investments need to be even greater and more targeted. I think, particularly at that, because it really does save lives. But that's a tough one because, particularly veterans, a lot of suicide-prone societies, indigenous groups, for example, like the Inuit or Native Americans have very high suicide rate. The Inuit of the Arctic
Really?
Circle, people who live up there, yeah. And and also veterans have very high suicides, and men have higher suicides than women. And I think part of the reason for this is a culture of stoicism in all of these groups. That's what one thing that they all share is a tendency not to want to talk about themselves and a real difficulty in sharing how they feel. And that, in a way, um, you can't really solve this kind of problem alone. You need someone with you. And so that's what makes counseling services sometimes not work as well as one would like. I think that's one of the reasons. It's also that many people are traumatized, as your son was, and trauma, psychological trauma as well as physical trauma, tends to shut down those parts, very parts of the brain that help you make sense of your emotions. So it can actually undermine the very mechanisms that you need to try to come to terms with whatever that trauma was. And that can be quite tricky. And so, there are things that help, and help people kind of reach into themselves. One of the things I found from speaking to veterans, I spoke to um, a few dozen veterans who very generously shared their experiences with me, and they had all had suicidal feelings in the past. Some of them had been hospitalized after attempts, and they were, what was kind of remarkable to me is that how many of them had engaged to try. I asked them, what made you feel better? How did you get through this? How did you find some kind of happiness in life or a reason for living? And so many of them had engaged in artistic projects, poetry, drama in particular, um, and memoir, and so on, and music. And I think there's something about bringing it helps art helps people bring out of themselves something that's locked inside, and even through symbolic means. And it did seem to help a lot of them do that. There's very good epidemiological evidence also on the effectiveness of psychedelic drugs, which, if used very carefully under medically supervised conditions, do seem to reduce suicidal feelings in people who are struggling with that, in depressed people. Um, and they don't know quite how it works. There are many theories, but it does seem to, what happens in depression is that you get locked into these spirals where you can't, these kind of negative thought patterns where you feel that every door in your life is shut. And psychedelic drugs seem to untangle whatever those brain networks are that lock people into those negative spirals and give them a sense of possibility so that they can make changes in their lives, which actually improve their lives and then get them out of those spirals. And the studies of that are pretty powerful, actually, and interesting. And it seems to be almost to work in a similar way that art does, in a sense. That it helps people sort of break out of these circuits. Um,
Well, to your
yeah.
point on, the stoicism, the this whole macho thing in our society has
Mhm.
to go away. It's one of the reasons that our kids are playing contact sports because we think they need to be men, or our women, our female athletes are pushed because, they're all going to be in the U.S. soccer team, which only has like, I don't know, 25 players. But we wear our children's brains out. And I am, a victim of this. My son wanted to play, I wanted him to be active. I didn't want him to get hurt. But I had no idea that these back-to-back sports over these years were going to impact his brain to a point where, he ran off a 100-foot cliff and he couldn't tell anybody. And we were best friends. I mean, we sat next to each other during COVID. I practiced my bagpipes. He'd play his game. And we're talking months of knee to knee. And, he was my soulmate and he couldn't tell me. And he couldn't tell his friends. He couldn't tell his coach. He couldn't tell anybody. And this poor boy ate schizophrenia and depression all on his own. And the reason I know so much about this, Helen, is that I've done a lot of spiritual work. I've done a lot of psychedelic work, and he came to me. And on to your point on these people don't know how much hurt they leave behind. Part of it is some of these people take their lives so they don't hurt other people. When they're dealing with schizophrenia, my son dealt with the most horrific thoughts that anybody should have to deal with. And we finding that a lot of these football players and baseball players struggling with the same thing, they have an option, whether they could succumb to these voices in their head that, they get effectively medicated, or like my son with no medication, what do I do? And they decide that their only option is to leave so that they don't carry out these demonic thoughts or wishes. And I wish like heck I could have known that he was struggling like this, because now we know that we have so many options to treat the brain. And maybe it was my macho part that, being a Green Beret Sergeant Major, that he felt he couldn't talk to me. He couldn't be weak or what. I mean, he's only 17. He's still a boy. But,
Mhm.
that part, it resonates, very well. And I can see where in societies where, that's a, a problem with it, whether it's just suicide today or relationships that fathers have with their kids. We've got to get off this macho stuff, man. It's just not, kids need to be kids, and sports we're learning needs to be kid friendly. It doesn't need to hurt. So that's, something that, we need to, definitely, work on. Um, but in your findings out there about art, music, and particularly on the psychedelic drugs, there's, to your point, medically supervised. These are not fun experiences, and I put that out for people think this is all recreational stuff. I've done just about all of them, and none of them are fun. When you got to
Yeah.
deal with your trauma, your guilt, the pain that you've inflicted on others, learn to love yourself, all acceptance. These are all perks to a drug because it does seem to rewire the brain. But of course, they're not available right now. Do you see a future where psychedelic therapy could be applicable to well, let me ask you this question first. I mean, because this is something that every parent asks us is, how do I know that my child is struggling, or my partner, or my husband,
Mm,
or wife who played a lot of contact sports? Because again, brain trauma and contact sports are not correlated in this country. So sometimes the effects don't manifest themselves for decades. And so
mm,
as people become aware, they're aware that, there might be substance abuse, violence, whatever. But I mean, they always ask us, how do I know that, that my significant other, or somebody that means a lot to me, or somebody I know, could be
mm.
struggling with suicide? Is there an answer to that at all?
Well, it's, as far as I know, the best thing you can do is ask them in a
Mm,
gentle, kind way. I mean, it sounds simple, but it isn't, of course.
mm,
And it's uh one of the difficulties is especially with these suicide prone societies that we talked about before, the macho ones in particular, is that there just isn't a language for talking about feelings very often. That's almost the definition of these kinds of stoic cultures. You don't talk about that. It was really interesting as I went up to the Arctic Circle and hung out with the Inuit people for um, a couple of weeks. And um, one of the things about that society is that they very recently were settled, really only in the 1950s and 60s. Before that, they mostly lived on the land in this incredibly difficult circumstances. I mean, the
like
winds
the
would
ice.
blow at 100 miles an hour. You had to build your house out of snow in a raging blizzard. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was you had to sort of sneak up on a seal to catch it. I mean, it was really or caribou or whatever. And so you really don't want drama queens in a situation like that, right? You
Right.
don't want people. So their whole culture is built around kind of the containment of emotion. But what they have instead is remarkable sense of community. Everybody is immensely sensitive to everyone else's feelings all the time. And they're living in quite close quarters in the winter. They're all inside and or in working in groups, especially. And so everybody kind of feelings are dispersed. The whole group experiences them kind of collectively and works to manage them. Whereas what happens when a group like that is suddenly transitioned into settled life, you have to manage your emotions alone, and you're subject to sometimes the insensitive treatment of others because everyone is thinking mostly about his own emotional and financial and every other type of well-being rather than the group. So you need very different sets of emotional skills to live in a society that is so-called modern. Um, and many of us modern people who've been modern for generations still struggle with that, I think, struggle a lot. Brain injuries make it, of course, infinitely worse because you're struggling with much deeper problems and even more sensitive than the average person to just the um, everyday struggles that we all have, I think, and that we all share, and that are much, much tougher than we like to admit sometimes.
Well,
So,
as we
yeah.
look at this digital, this modern world, right? And now
Mm,
we've got these cell phone thingies, and we got computers, and now we got eyeglasses that can talk to you, and we have AI, now we've got children that are falling in love with things on AI and taking their lives. I mean, I just read a horrible story about this wonderful 15 or 17-year-old who fell in love with an AI avatar and took his life. And
Mm.
so where has the intersection of digitalization and social media and AI? I know my son was a big gamer. My son was a very, very prolific gamer, and he loved it. And I used to love sitting by him and watching the gaming. But after he died, we found out, that he was on Snapchat and all these other things. And while we didn't find for him anything really, he was struggling with his own mental illness. He really didn't advertise. He wasn't really talking to anybody about it. Wasn't looking for ways to kill himself. But he was
Mm.
still all on these social media channels right now. Did your research indicate that, that this is contributing to this rise in suicide and that, just to, something else for parents to start, worrying about or be on the eye for or be on the lookout for?
As far as I understand, the data on gaming in particular, not social media, but gaming um, doesn't suggest a connection. At least as far as researchers have been able to detect, there doesn't seem to be an issue with gaming. But yes, indeed, AI is really scary. It's quite new. Um, and it does create this illusion of intimacy. Um, that is, of course, false because you're dealing with a mechanical object and not a real human being. And many people, it does seem, have been kind of led into these dark um, channels um, into these very dark spaces um, by social media, either sort of other people acting from a distance in very insensitive ways, bullying and so on, and also into by AI increasingly. We will have to see where AI goes. It's quite new, but as far as social media goes, the data is pretty strong for the United States. I think that social media and it can be quite dangerous for kids, but I think it has to do with pre-existing mental struggles, which we also need to worry about, and maybe kind of primary because um, we don't see that correlation in other Western countries where social media has also taken off. So there seems to be something about the interaction, the way we use social media in the United States that is at the moment special. Um,
Or
although,
unspecial?
and I, unspecial, yeah. And I think yeah. Um, and I think it's something particular with, yeah, as we discussed before, the sort of go it alone macho culture, which affects everything, not just our emotional and psychological lives, but the shape of our economy and the way we treat each other and so on, and the tone of our public discourse and so on, which is so becoming increasingly harsh. It's always been pretty tough, but boy, lately it's gotten so mean, and I don't think this is going to help.
No, and it's horrible that we can't accept that whatever side of the line you're on, the other half of America is just stupid or whatever. I mean, it's idiocy, and
Mm.
there's a lot of lack of respect there, and a lot of lack of love that really needs to start coming back into our discourse. What do you? What is the? You just brought up a good point because you don't read about these problems in Japan or Europe, right? And with social
Mm.
media and stuff. What is? I mean, I find it appalling that, I mean, one
Mhm.
time, I'm not, making this up. My son, he was on his iPad, and I clicked on a button that looked weird, and all of a sudden, there's two people naked having sex on my son's like 9-year-old iPad. And I'm like, hey, boy, where did this come from? And what it was he was chasing a game around the internet, and these savages had somehow slipped in. He was downloading things trying to get to this game, and he ended up downloading that, sexual act. And so, of course, we started locking down stuff, but it seems like you can find anything. Any 8-year-old can find anything they want on the internet, and there's no, there's no recourse or consequences for that. What is the difference and how Europe treats social media than we do? Is there more consequences for? Do you know what the difference is?
I don't know. I mean, I know that I think in Australia, they banned it from schools and certain things.
Good.
I'm not aware of I'm not aware of in the non-Anglophone world, though, of legislation about that. It's worth looking into, and I have not done so, um, or even debates about it. And I don't know why. I mean, I know I lived in Europe for some years, and um, um, I got the sense that there was less. I think being young is always in modern times very, very difficult. I don't know if you remember a famous anthropologist called Margaret Mead. Have you
Mm.
heard of her? She was very distinguished because she went out to the South Pacific in the 1920s, and she studied a group of people and she wrote a famous book called Coming of Age of Samoa in Samoa. And there was a big debate at that time because prior to her, there was a psychologist called Stanley Hall who'd written a famous book called Adolescence, which was all about the struggles of young people and the angst and the anguish and the sort of what was called the Sturm and Drang, the storm and stress of adolescence, the struggle to find one's own identity. And she wrote in her book that people in the South Pacific who lived according to these kind of traditional ways in close-knit communities where everyone kind of had a role to play. You caught fish, you did the cooking, you climbed the coconut tree or something like that. They didn't go through that. Adolescence for them was, an increasing number of responsibilities, and you got interested in sex and all sorts of things, but didn't go through this angst, this anguish. And since then, studies have shown that global societies have really shown that adolescent angst and the struggle to find oneself and the agony of that is really something quite unique to modern societies. That traditional cultures, human societies, um, do not have that experience for the most part. I mean, some people struggle, of course, but for the most part, you were judged on how generous you were and how much you pitched in for others, and how much you conform to the norms of the group, of course, which not everybody wants to do all the time. But the real pain of finding yourself, of constantly having to think, who am I? Where will I end up? What can I do? Who are my friends? Who are not my friends? This didn't really arise in traditional human societies, and yet it's probably the hardest thing we ever do as human beings, and I think that's why youth is such a vulnerable period in our lives for suicide and for mental illness in general. And of course, social media pretends to help us find answers. It's like this kind of cruel joke. We think um, um, the computer or the cell phone is finally going to open up this world to us, but it's a counterfeit world. It's a fake world, and it's useful for some things, for work, for example, but it's not
Yeah.
a substitute for social life and other human beings that love and care about you. And that is the imperative. That is what we really need to find.
And you
And
might
some
have
will.
brought up, and I think a good point that you just brought up, the difference between us and I've got a nephew that's in Germany right now, and they are such a family centric unit. Like the whole family, multi generations of family, they hang out together every day, every weekend. They help each other out. They raise each other's kids. I mean, you can't even get neighbors to get along in this country right now, right? And they don't,
Mhm.
they don't trust each other. There's not that. I think being more family centric and having the family around and together, I think has a lot to do with that, because there is, we tend to leave our kids alone, right? We babysit them with TVs and iPods and iPads, and we think that's cool. Heck, parents even use sports as babysitter events. Hey, let me just chuck you in a bunch of sports and I'll sit here and read my book or whatever, right? And so I think the level of involvement that we either expect nowadays as parents or, schools are now a babysitting service, right? I'm just gonna get rid of my kid for the day, right? And not that all parents feel like that, and it's that we're talking, maybe subset, but we do know that in America today, we're not family centric. And I think that getting back to that, I even got a daughter right now who's trying to figure out how to get us all in one house. Of course, I got a grandson now where I got all kinds of interest in that. But
Mm,
I think that's something to be said there. And,
yeah,
and that's a good point.
yeah.
Going back to brain injured persons, you made a comment a little bit earlier, like, if you with a brain injury, and whether we're not talking just contact sports or being a service, you're talking about car crashes, falls, violent crime, whatever.
Mhm.
You've got, the odds or, it seems like you've got, besides the struggles, you're saying that the suicidal ideation is probably even more problematic for those people.
Um, um, yeah, yeah, yeah. I think, um, yeah, I'm not sure how much I think the struggles with, mental illness, let's say, in general, particularly depression, particularly the psychotic disorders like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, are extremely, people with those problems are and major depression and so on are very, very high risk for suicide. So more than half of all suicides, depending on the country, sometimes up to
Wow.
90% are affected by one or other of those conditions. So any brain injury is going to, number one, increase just the organic likelihood that something like that will happen. The brain doesn't work as well. And it will also increase the kind of self consciousness, the fears, and um, that also exacerbate depression itself. So there's the consciousness of the injury, and there's the injury itself, and there's the attitude of others to you when you have such problems, because the world turns away. We turn away from people with those kinds of problems. It's an active effort to take care of someone who's struggling with mental illness sometimes. And that means those people are increasingly alone. And um, when they really, most of all, need engagement, they need someone to just say, hey, come on, um, let's hang out or something, or let's talk. Uh, and so I think there's an organic mechanism operating there, and there's a psychosocial aspect to it too, which makes it particularly difficult. And it gets back to this issue of families too. I mean, families normally, this is something they could rally around when American families are under so much stress at the moment,
No doubt.
with inflation, with everything else. It's it's very, very um, people are really, really struggling in a way that Europeans are more cushioned by a kind of welfare state, which not only reduces the economic burden on families, but it also creates this sort of idea that there's some big thing out there taking care of you. And so people are less existentially stressed out all the time. They're less, um, you know, worried and kind of panicked about not only am I going to be able to pay the rent tomorrow, but what does it mean that I can't? What does it mean that I'm not adequate to doing this on my own? And that's a terrible, terrible feeling. Whereas, in France or Italy, they might more likely to be saying, I can't pay the rent. It's the government's fault that I can't do that. They're not managing the economy properly. They're not making sure that our wages are adequate and so on.
Right.
So
They're
um, here we blame ourselves, and that just compounds everything. It makes us harder, makes it harder to take care of ourselves, makes it harder to take care of each other too.
Yeah, and it is tough out there right now. I don't think I've ever seen it, you know, this bad with the folks I talk to, and it's,
Yeah.
it's not a political thing. It's just where we're ending up right now with, our
Mm,
focus on making all the money in the world and not and our lack of focus on each other. And I think that's
mm,
where, I think your book goes to the point of that is that I think by taking care of each other and having that trust and foundation where either we're asking the right questions. Because I remember 2 days before my son left me, we went outside and I'd give him a beer any now. He's getting ready to join the army. You can have a beer. And we sit on a rock wall and we planned out our next trip. We had a father and son trip every year. This one was to Japan. I said, all right.
mm,
And we've been to the pyramids. We've been all over this world. And he said, all right, Dad, no more 2-week trips. Okay. You got to keep it down to 1 week. You might kind of make me crazy. I'm like, all right, son. And I said, all right, well, we're going to in and out, man. 7 days, you and me in Japan. You're getting ready to join the army. He goes, all right, Dad. And I asked him, is everything all right? He goes, yeah, Dad, everything's fine. And
mm,
because I used to ask him, not as much as now. Looking back, gosh, the grit, just the guilt that you have, the things that woulda, shoulda, coulda, and it eats you alive as the parent of a dead child, and because it's always your fault, even though. I've resolved everything as much as I can. I was a good dad. I still carry that guilt every day. And it'll be with me till the end, until I see him again. That's why I do this thing to kind of make him proud, and let him know that I'm doing my best to whatever, my oversights were, or my mistakes that, I am honestly trying to do better and make a difference. But, as we get ready to close out, if you have any last thoughts on this issue, this terrible, unfortunate reality that faces not only me, just I'm a parent, but there's so many other people that are struggling not only with the possibility of harming themselves, but you got family members that don't know what to ask or anything. If you have any advice, or
mm.
last words, I'd appreciate your thoughts.
Yeah. Um, I I too felt one of the things I noticed, in my own, um I mean, two things. One of them is that I think everyone who loses someone asks themselves the questions that you're asking, and we all make mistakes with each other. I mean, that's the whole thing about human beings that makes us not computers, is that we do wonderful, original, amazing things, and we screw and we screw up sometimes. But
I'm
but that's
definitely
not
not a
why.
computer. I could barely turn one on.
Yeah. But we're not, but we're not, we're not infallible, and it's not about any one thing you might have said or done that
Mm,
triggered this. It's
no,
about the world in which you and he grew up and came of age. And that's the point that I'm trying to make in the book, is that it's not about what any individual said or did. It's about the structures around us that we can't even see, but that shape our behavior and that shape our thought patterns and shape the way we see each ourselves and others. And that's really where I think we need to put the focus, rather than because one will never stop asking questions like the ones you're asking, but um it's really not about you. It's about the world that we've built and that we've constructed, which is just so tough that some people just can't make it. And um and I think, another thing is that I noticed also with my friend who took her own life, um that she fell into this, about a year before she died, I guess. She fell into this very dark depression, and I tried to talk to her, and she couldn't get the words out. It was this thing of not having a language, I guess. It was sort of to the way the Inuit are, veterans are. She didn't know how to talk about herself in some way. Um, And so, and I didn't know much about suicide then, and so I didn't think much of it. And then I called her and she sounded so much more cheerful the next morning. And then I saw her again and she was fine, didn't want to talk about it. And I think once people resolve that, that's a time to worry in a weird way, is when these people who are suicidal, sometimes they make this decision, which is that I'm going to get out of this. And then it becomes very hard to reach them because they don't show signs of depression. They seem to be brightening up. They seem to be cheered up because they've sort of resolved this. And that makes it even tougher. And it makes it even more difficult to break through, even more difficult for therapy to work. So this is why we need somehow to work on, if you can't change the entire world and the social structure of the United States, you can at least try to work with the people around you to try to create a kind of kinder micro world where everyone feels they belong. And
Mm,
that's um, that's really through one thing or another. So all power to your daughter in a way, I
yeah.
think.
Well, I mean, it's to your point, when my son's last video, well, his only video that he posted just before he took his life, he was happy. He's
Mhm.
like, I've been struggling for 2 years, and he goes, I'm done. And he got happy. He goes, I'm
Mm,
done. And he
yeah,
was that confident, and he was stone cold sober
yeah.
that he was going to do the right thing. And I have to honor that. And it wasn't, and finally, and one of the trips that the psychedelic journeys I had, I got right in touch with him, and he let me know that he was scared. He was that he had hurt us,
Mhm.
and that we were angry with him for doing what he did. And I'm like, son, dude, we just miss you. I'm not angry with you. You made the decision, and for you, it was the right one at that time, and I have to honor that. I just wish you could have talked to me. I so wish it was different, but it's not, and I'll never be angry with you. But I do miss you, and that's that. So I was able to. I felt like I was. Even angels have their doubts, right? And I was able to comfort him on that. But Miss Epstein, I want to thank you so much. This is obviously a tough subject, not only for me, but for a lot of people that listen to this call to even think about, right? It's not that you
Mhm.
don't even have to be a part of it. It's just that's what's so crazy about this issue of suicide is that you can't fathom it. You can't understand it unless you're either suffering severely or know somebody that's, contemplating it, but you just cannot fathom why, this happens so often. And trying to understand that only helps us become more aware and maybe pushes us to right things. Maybe we can turn down that social media dial and get our kids off this craziness and just go play games and swing from apple trees or whatever it takes, right? But I want to thank you so much for your time today and for your just your insight on this issue, and just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for the work you do, actually, which I think, it's one of those things that could make a difference in bringing people together to talk more openly about this issue and our shared struggle. So, thanks a million.
No, well, thank you. And for anybody that's listening today, if you do know anybody that's struggling, whether it's yourself, somebody you love, or somebody that ask them. Okay, ask them. And their suicide 911 numbers are out there. You can have anybody call us. They call our foundation. We put them in touch with other veterans. Whatever we got to do to help. So, I mean, if this is an issue that touches you, more realistically than others, please reach out. But thank you again, Dr. Epstein. Really appreciate you. And everybody, another great episode of Broken Brains. Probably not our happiest one, but again, informative, and that is why I here. That's why we are here. Don't forget the Army Navy game, December 13th. We're going to be raising money for suicide prevention and mental health illness for our veterans. Download the free book off our website, Youth Contact Sports and Broken Brains. Become informed so you can keep going. And like us, subscribe us, push us out there. Please, we always can use support out there. We want to thank our sponsor, Blue Fusion, who's helping us with the Army-Navy game out there. Amazing data and analytics company. And I want to thank you all for listening again. And remember, if you have children, they only got one melon. Take care of that thing. God bless you all. We'll see you again on Broken Brains. Take care.